Hi, intro students. So we're going to pick up in this video with chapter 2 of the Henslin textbooks of your readings. Chapter 2 is all about culture, and so we're going to be breaking it down. Um, I might be able to get it all in one video, but I'm not positive about that, so it may end up being broken up over a couple. Let's see how this works. So first of all, we're talking about culture, as was discussed in another video that I posted for you all. We're not just talking about art or movies or music, and those things are part of culture, obviously. But culture is much broader, much bigger than that. And so it really is, it's language, beliefs, values, norms, the expected behaviors of people in a given society, even the material objects that are used in a society, like which utensils you use to eat with, for example, all characterize a group and then are passed on from one generation to the next. Now, that's a general definition of culture. Culture gets much more complicated, though, when you start breaking it down. First, we have material culture. Material culture is basically what it sounds like. It's material objects that distinguish a group of people. The main thing is that they are objects. It could be art, buildings, weapons, utensils, machines, even hairstyle, clothing, jewelry, any of these things, religious symbols that are used, such as whether you wear a cross around your neck or a Star of David or some other religious symbol. Those would all be aspects of material culture. Non material culture, also called symbolic culture, is much more about the ideas and the ideology that is framed by the material culture. So, this would be a group's way of thinking about the world in general. So, these would be beliefs, values, and just general assumptions about how the world works. And also, then, what that means, such as what is considered common patterns of behavior, such as language and other expectations in terms of interactions. Now, as I've already said in previous videos, culture is how we make sense of the world. But most people have a very hard time seeing their own culture. And one of the things I recommend to all students of sociology who are interested in going further in their understanding of the field is to try to get international experience, to try to get as much cross cultural experience as you possibly can, because nothing brings home the differences between culture, between your culture and other cultures, than going to another culture and trying to learn how they understand the world and how the other culture operates and works. There's an old joke, and humor is one of those things that's tied to culture as well. And so this is a joke that if I were telling it 50, 60 years ago, people would be rolling. But, telling it now, it's more to illustrate a point in a fun way. People don't find it very funny, I've noticed. So here's how the joke goes. There are two young fish who are swimming in a lake, and an older fish swims by them. And the older fish, because in this joke, fish can talk, the older fish says to the younger fish, "Well, boys, how's the water?" And the younger fish don't respond, don't say anything, and they just awkwardly swim off. And then once they're far enough away from the older fish, one of the young fish turns to the other young fish and says, "Water? What's he talking about?" Now, uh, boom, boom, boom. All right, there's the punchline to the joke. So, what is that actually saying? Well, if you've lived your entire life like that fish in water, why would you even be aware of it? That's just a taken for granted part of your reality. And culture works like that for humans. So if you've only experienced one culture, you probably think that your culture is the best, your culture is the right way of doing things, and people who do things differently are somehow wrong. Um, Most people who have only experienced one culture their entire life end up making the assumption that, well, that's just how things are, and they tend to not even question their own culture. Well, in sociology, one of the biggest parts of it is being able to step outside of your own culture and then turn and study it as something that is separate from you, but yet you are still part of. So, one of the things that we find when you experience other cultures would be what's referred to as culture shock. It's a general disorientation that people experience. And when they're taken for granted assumptions about how life works or how life is, quote unquote, supposed to work, end up being challenged. Now, you don't have to get on a plane and travel to another country altogether to end up experiencing culture shock, because if you're a part of one subculture and you've experienced nothing but that subculture for your entire life, you can find other subcultures even within your own broader culture. It might be someone that's a neighbor of yours who ends up practicing a very different cultural way of being, that you might experience a kind of culture shock when you end up learning about. Now, the thing is that people end up assuming, like I said, that their culture, if that's all they've ever experienced, is the correct way to do things. But there's nothing, or natural way of doing things, but there's nothing natural about culture. Culture develops out of history, out of people making decisions, people deciding certain things, and it becoming a part of how people practice life more generally. And so, how at whatever aspect of culture you want to look at, that aspect of culture is going to have a history. And you're going to be able to go back and study when that cultural aspect started, why it was started, what happened that caused people to start doing things a certain way or thinking a certain way, what have you. But there's nothing natural about it in the sense that culture is not written into our genetics. And so, a baby born in one culture versus another is going to adapt to whichever culture they're raised in, regardless of what their genetics are. And so that's what's meant by there's nothing inherently natural about culture. All right. Now, ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is oftentimes confused with racism. And while there's similarities, certainly, they don't mean exactly the same thing. So, ethnicity is much more about culture. That's why we're talking about it here. So, ethnocentrism is this assumption that your culture is the superior and correct culture, and thus you use your culture as a kind of yardstick to measure the value of all other cultures instead of just accepting that there's just simply differences. So, an ethnocentric person would only respect their own culture, and they would not have any respect for others' cultures. Now, sociologists practice what is referred to as cultural relativism. And this is an important thing to develop if you want to go on in the field of sociology. It would be very difficult for someone who is strongly ethnocentric to really understand the lessons that sociology has to teach. But relativism is not judging a culture, but trying to understand it on its own terms, trying to understand why people in a different culture do what they do. Maybe studying the history of the culture, understanding when cultural changes occurred and why they occurred, what social forces brought them about. And so it's kind of cultural relativism is a way of trying to combat this feeling that your culture is somehow better than others' cultures. And if you think that about your own culture, then you're never going to be able to understand another's culture. As I've often said, if you are too busy judging, then you're never going to be able to understand. Judging gets in the way of understanding. So, um, now we can also see this ethnocentrism in terms of history in a way where it can be practiced even within a single culture. Now, there's a logical fallacy, historians talk about it. It's referred to as presentism. It's where people end up judging the standards of the past, even in their own culture historically, with how things are in the present. And so um, the idea is that you can apply concepts, values, terms that exist in today's culture to the past, and they're just as valid in the past as they are today. And since things change constantly, that's not the case at all. Now, we see that there have been academic arguments for ethnocentrism. Um, they largely came out of the 1990s, though, and you certainly don't hear sociologists making these arguments typically. But Robert Edgerton, who is an anthropologist, by the way, not a sociologist, though the two fields are related, in 1992 published a book called Sick Societies, where he argues that you can judge cultures based on the concept of quality of life. Well, there's several issues here right off the bat. First, define quality of life. Whatever definition you come up with, it's going to be shot through with your own cultural biases. Because quality of life is going to depend largely on your cultural understanding of what that concept means. Secondly, even if we are going to say that there's some global standard of quality of life that we can appeal to, well, Robert Edgerton ended up, concluding that Western societies are best and have the highest quality of life. Well, that's only true if you're highly selective. If you are don't look at people living in poverty, if you don't look at homelessness, if you don't look at all of the issues of inequality that exist within Western societies. Not to say that they don't exist in other societies too, of course they do. The point is being that it's cherry picking your data. It's bad science, effectively. So let's start looking more in depth at this concept of symbolic culture. Um, Symbolic culture, as the name starts off with, when you start with the concept of a symbol. So, a symbol is anything that people attach significance or meaning to and then use to communicate with one another. So, anything along those lines would be a symbol. And we're awash in symbols. We're so awash with them that we oftentimes don't even realize it. That we are a highly symbolic species. And this goes back to symbolic interactionism and their argument and their research that demonstrates that most human communication is nonverbal communication. So then, in this sense, the things that are nonverbal are symbolic, are symbols that we're using to communicate with one another. The next would be gestures. Now, gestures are a kind of symbol as well. It's the way that people use their bodies to communicate with one another. And this is highly culturally dependent. For instance, in most Arab cultures, The left hand is considered dirty because that's the hand after going to the bathroom that you're expected to clean yourself with. So if someone hands you something and you accept it or reach for it with your left hand, that's actually considered offensive. Or if you hand something to somebody with your left hand. So everything should be done with your right hand. I experienced this when I spent time in Cairo, Egypt, because I'm predominantly left-handed. Um, and so I had to keep like a mantra in my head: don't reach with your left hand, don't reach with your left hand, don't reach with your left hand, just so because I didn't want to offend people, obviously. Um, so what about the American AOK sign? Like this, right? AOK. Um, that sign is actually in southern Italy, and now you even get how it is divvied up by regions, because this is true of southern Italy, but not necessarily northern Italy. If you do that in southern Italy, it's considered an offensive gesture because it's considered a gesture referencing someone's genitalia. Then in Turkey, for instance, if you sit and you cross your legs and you show the sole of your foot to another person, that would be similar to showing your middle finger to somebody in our culture. And so all of these would be gestures that require cultural interpretation because they're symbolic and forms of communication. And so when traveling abroad, it's important to understand these kinds of cultural differences so that you can be as respectful as possible. Now, language itself is a part of symbolic culture. Obviously, language is a system of symbols that can be combined in an infinite number of ways. So, language can be constantly changing, and there's no upward limit on how many words that we can invent. And so language is incredibly versatile and it's not just about labeling things. Oftentimes, when you talk about language, people think it's just labeling things. Language is a lot more than that. And it also is in terms of abstract thought. I mean, I've been using language in these videos to discuss highly abstract concepts, not just going through and labeling what things are. Now, there's some basic aspects to language we're going to go through quickly here. The first one is that language and why it's important for society. Language, number one, allows us to extend our understanding of time into the past and into the future. So if we want to remember history, if we want to plan for the future, language is primary. You have to have language in order to do that. Otherwise, without language, you're just living in the constant present with no sense of the future, no sense of the past, um, or no way to communicate it anyway. Number two, language allows the accumulation of information across generations. What that means is that language keeps us from having to reinvent the wheel every generation, that we can learn from past generations and the knowledges that are passed down, that have been written down. And so we can always constantly keep building on what came before. Number three, language is also how we frame and perceive the world. So, for example, if we were to look at the Native American tribe, the Inuits, um, who have historically they were called Eskimos, and at this point in time, the Inuits have kind of embraced Eskimo, but it was originally an insult, and it was because Europeans who first came across these northern tribes ended up asking a rival tribe to the Inuits what the tribe was called, and they gave their offensive name for them, which was Eskimo, which in their language translates to blubber eater. And so when people talk about Eskimos, that's not the actual correct name for the tribe. Inuit is. But anyways, Inuits live in very cold climates with a lot of diversity in terms of wintry precipitation. And so we end up seeing that while those of us who live in more southerly climates will have, and who do still experience a winter of some sort, will have distinctions like sleet, frost, snow, ice storms, things like that. But the Inuits have far more words for wintry precipitation, and they even perceive these finer distinctions between them. Whereas for us, if you were not familiar with these finer distinctions and you were to go and live among the Inuit for a period of time, um, I mean, over time you would be able to learn how to make the distinctions, but at first, um, you the distinctions they're making wouldn't make any sense to you. It would just seem like they were making arbitrary distinctions until you were trained to notice the differences. Now, this leads us to what is known in linguistics and linguistic anthropology as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this was Edward Sapir and Benjamin Worth's hypothesis that language creates ways of thinking and perceiving that ends up framing how we interact, understand, see the world around us. Now, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is generally rejected by linguists, but it's complicated. Sapir and Whorf ended up suggesting that if a culture didn't already have a concept of something, that they wouldn't even be able to see it. So if you were to take, say, a chair, for instance, and drop it down among a tribal society that doesn't have chairs, Sapir and Whorf would end up predicting that the people wouldn't even see it. And well, that's when you take it to that extreme, then no, the hypothesis doesn't work out. And linguists are correct to reject the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. However, if you understand it as that, if you take an object, say like a chair, and drop it among a society that doesn't have chairs, that doesn't mean that they won't see it. Of course, they will, but they're not going to automatically make the same kinds of cultural understandings as the society that built the chair. So they might come up with different uses for it. They might find they certainly aren't going to call it a chair. They'll call it something from their own language. And so, in this sense, the chair will be reconstructed or recreated symbolically by the culture that's now interpreting it that had never seen one before. And so, in that sense, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis does work to a much more limited degree. And so, it depends on how far you take it, whether or not Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has evidence to back it up or not. If you take it to too far of an extreme, then no, it doesn't work. It falls apart. All right. The fourth aspect of language would be that language allows us to develop more complex societies. And this is connected to the last one, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every generation. And we don't have to reinvent society every generation. So that means that every generation we're able to change and build on what we inherit from past generations. And we couldn't do that if it weren't for language. And then finally, number five, language allows complex collective goal oriented behavior. So, for instance, imagine I'm not going to do this, but imagine I broke all of you up into different groups. And I gave you all a goal to achieve, but I told you that you weren't allowed to discuss the goal using language. You weren't allowed to just use language at all in terms of assigning who does what part. You weren't allowed to use language to talk about how you're going to achieve the goal or You're not allowed to use language to try to understand exactly what I meant by the goal. How effective do you think you would be? Probably not very. And so it's thanks to language that we can have complex, goal oriented behavior among groups. All right. Now we're going to get into some material that's really important for your breaching experiments. Now, the breaching experiments were developed by a sociologist in the 1970s known as Harold Garfinkel. Garfinkel we'll be talking about more later on. He is the one who develops the theoretical perspective as well as the methodology called ethnomethodology. And breaching experiments are a part of that. It's where you identify a clear norm and then go out and purposefully violate it. So let's look at some of this. Values are the first part. Now, values are opinions. People oftentimes use the word opinion wrong. They use opinion to mean just any general perspective. And that's not what the word opinion actually means. The word opinion means a value judgment. And so morals would be values. Morals are opinions. What is desirable or undesirable, good or bad, beautiful or ugly. These are all values that are culturally dependent, and there is no way to scientifically establish a value as being more effective than another. Values are truly just a question of your perspective and what you feel is most important. And that typically comes from whatever social group you've been raised by. So, when people use the word opinion just to mean an analysis or an interpretation, that's a misuse of the word. Analysis and interpretation are not opinions. Um, Scientific studies are not opinions. Scientific theories are not opinions. Morals, values, those are opinions. All right. Now, let's get into norms. Norms are what people expect within a given cultural context for right social behavior, what is considered correct social behavior for that historical period, for that culture, for that society. Now, norms themselves break down in terms of seriousness. And so the norms that you should be breaking for your breaching experiment should only be folkways. Folkways are norms that are not strictly enforced. So, for instance, it's a norm to sit in a chair with the back of the chair against your back. But if you flip the chair around and sit in it backwards, yeah, technically you're violating a norm, but it's not one that's taken very seriously. That's not also that wouldn't be because it's not taken very seriously. That wouldn't be a good thing to pick for your breaching experiment because you probably won't get any reactions out of it whatsoever. Um, Now, to distinguish folkways from other aspects of norms, the next level of seriousness would be mores. Now, mores are norms that are strictly enforced and are taken far more seriously. These mores are in societies with law. They're oftentimes written into law. Within institutions, they're written into policies, codes of conduct, things like that. And so these are also ones that mores come with much more serious punishments if you break them. Now, the strongest norm is a taboo. And a taboo is a norm that's so strong in a society that even thinking about breaking it ends up causing people of the culture to feel disgust and revulsion. Like I was talking about earlier in another video about the incest taboo. Now, if you violate a norm, or if you follow a norm, you end up getting sanctions. Sanctions can be expressions of approval or disapproval regarding whether you're following or breaking a norm. Now, generally speaking, if you're following norms, you tend to get positive sanctions. It could be anything from a smile to, good job, all the way up to, material benefits like promotions, raises, things of this sort. Negative sanctions typically are expressions of disapproval or punishments for violating a norm, which could be mild, such as just a frown if you're breaking a folkway, or a dirty look, all the way up to the death sentence in American society as being the most harsh negative sanction that we have. Now, here's where things get more complicated, because you can get a positive sanction for breaking a norm, and you can get a negative sanction for following a norm. So, here's how this works. Say that you're doing your breaching experiment, and you pick a norm to violate, and other people start laughing with you, not at you, with you, and maybe even join in and start doing it with you. Well, that doesn't mean you didn't violate a norm. It just means that the people who saw you violating the norm don't take the norm as seriously, and they find your violation of it amusing. So they end up giving you a positive sanction for it. Negative sanctions can be given for following norms. One good example, every region where cars exist and people drive, people develop what's called a driving culture. So this would be the ways that people typically use the road and people typically drive. Now, driving culture can be loosely based on traffic laws, which would be mores, but they aren't always. And sometimes the driving culture actually violates traffic laws. I'll give you an example. Here in Southeast Texas, people typically use the left lane as a lane to just drive in. It's actually a personal pet peeve of mine. The left lane is intended for passing or for turning left. And so if you're driving in the right lane like you're supposed to, and somebody else is just behind you in the left lane, and then you need to get over to turn left, and so you get in front of them and then put on your brakes to turn left, and they start honking and throwing up the middle finger and everything because you just made them slam on their brakes. Well, they're giving you a negative sanction for actually following the norms, but you weren't following the driving culture, and so that's why you got the negative sanction. So keep this in mind when you're doing your breaching experiments, that norms and sanctions are far more complicated than just follow the norm, get a positive sanction, break the norm, get a negative sanction. And also do not violate any mores, do not violate any taboos, and do not violate mask ordinances, do not violate social distancing when you're doing the breaching experiment. Norms are all around us, including in the virtual world. And so you can get on social media and or on your phone and violate norms and deal with sanctions without even having to go physically and be physically in the presence of another person. Um, Other ideas for breaching experiments that people have done in the past that Garfinkel had his students doing, were things like going home to visit their parents or caregivers while growing up, and then acting formally like their parents' home is a hotel. And when they eat dinner, it's a restaurant, and they end up tipping their parents and things like that. Um, these kinds of things are kind of fun to do. because oftentimes people have no idea how to react, and they think there's something wrong with you. It's like, are you doing drugs? Do you have a break? I mean, are you under a lot of stress? What's going on with you? So the automatic assumption is if you're not following the norms, there's got to be something wrong with you, right? It couldn't possibly be that you're just challenging the unquestioned way things people do things. Um, there are a lot of other examples, but the ones that keep popping into my mind would require you to violate social distancing. One thing I would suggest is get on YouTube and just type in breaching experiments, and there is a wealth of examples of breaching experiments where people have filmed them and then posted them to YouTube. Now, you're not required to film the breaching experiments yourself. Actually, filming them can throw them off because if people notice that you're filming them, then they'll change their behaviors because that cues them in that something's up. All right. Now, norms are not always expected to be followed in a society. And so, for instance, there are moral holidays. Now, following all societies have norms and have normative structures. And so, following the norms 24/7, day in, day out, can get exhausting, can get tiring. And people want to break from the everyday. And so every culture, every society has what is called moral holidays. And these are festivals, celebrations, periods of time when norms are expected to be violated. One big example in American culture would be Halloween. So don't try to do your breaching experiments during Halloween because then you wouldn't be violating any norms because you're expected to violate norms on Halloween. You would actually be following the norms to break the norms on Halloween because it's a moral holiday. Then you have moral holiday places. Moral holiday places are places that exist where people can go outside of the moral holiday, where norms are always expected to be broken. An example in American culture would be Las Vegas. We even call it Sin City. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? Well, all of those are examples of talking about Vegas as a moral holiday places where norms are expected to be broken. I remember the first time that I ever went to Vegas, and I was walking around in the streets with a drink. I felt really anxious about it because I'd always learned you go to a bar and you get a drink, you stay in that bar until you finish your drink. You certainly don't walk outside and down the sidewalk and go someplace else carrying the drink, and you would see Las Vegas police walking by, and you're just walking around with a drink. Same with New Orleans. And at first, it made me anxious, and then I realized, okay, calm down. This is normal. This is considered normal for this area. So then we also have a concept that's actually controversial, that's debated in sociology. There's not a sociological consensus on this, but it's the normalization of deviance. And here's the idea is that if you have a broader structure of normative expectations, and then in a particular area something breaks down, something's not working, you don't have the resources you need, you don't have the clear structure and expectations that society typically sets up for people. Then what can occur is what would be considered deviant to the broader normative society, but is considered normal for that area. So, for instance, this would be examples where people are violating the law, breaking the law, and if somebody plays the role of a whistleblower and tries to bring attention to it, and the whistleblower gets punished, then that would mean that the deviance that's occurring in that particular area, it has become normalized and is now expected. Other sociologists who are critical of this concept argue that that's a contradiction of terms, that deviance means the violation of norms, and so it's impossible to normalize deviance. Now, a lot of this comes down to the question of how you interpret normative structures and which normative structures you're appealing to, and whether or not you see those broader normative structures as legitimate over a particular area where we would see deviance is occurring. Is it the normalization of deviance, or is it simply just deviance that's occurring? And we can't say it's normalized. Well, again, sociologists argue about this point. It's not a simple answer. It's fairly complex. All right. Now, in the 1950s, we have an anthropologist by the name of Horace Minor. And he wrote an article. You have the notes, and you can look the article up online. It's a famous article. Intro students in sociology all over the world typically will learn about this article. It's called Body Ritual Among the Nasarima. Now, here's how it basically breaks down. He looks at the body rituals of this tribal group called the Nasarima, and says culturally that they view bodies as being disgusting, things to hide, things to cover up, things to be ashamed of. The smells of the body, of just your natural smells. I'm not talking about being dirty, just the natural smell of the body must be covered. Things like this, and they develop shrines to controlling and altering the body to make it more socially acceptable, more normative for how their culture views bodies. And within the shrines, they'll have sacred boxes, and these sacred boxes will be full of elixirs and potions and things that oftentimes older Nasarima won't even touch, because are things that were supposed to help them with if they've been struck with illness, or they believe that evil spirits had entered them, or anything like this. But oftentimes they will forget what the potions and elixirs were for, and they see them as being so powerful that they won't even take them, even if though that they keep them. And so you ask them, well, why would you keep them if you're never going to take them? Because you're afraid they might hurt you, because you don't remember what they were for. And they would say, well, you never know if I might need it. Well, if you don't know what it's for, when would you know if you need it? But they still keep it, so illustrating the cultural significance of it. Now, in this society, this is what we call a patriarchal society, which means male-dominated. Matriarchal societies would be female-dominated societies, and that we see most of the labor that goes into child rearing is placed on the shoulders of women. And so, in particular, one of the things that women are expected to do is to train children in the normative, expected ways of engaging in the shrines and controlling their bodies. And it's believed that if women fail in this endeavor, that evil spirits will enter the child's head, and they will be damaged for the rest of their life. I mean, so no pressure, right? Now, Minor ends up saying that the Nasarima have a masochistic culture that causes them to develop sadistic institutions. So, masochism is deriving pleasure from having pain inflicted on you. Sadistic would be deriving pleasure from inflicting pain on someone else. So he says it's a masochistic culture with sadistic institutions to meet the masochistic desires of the culture. So he goes through and starts talking about some very specific examples. And he talks about the medicine men, who work with the group that he terms the Vestal Virgins. Now, the Nasarima don't call them Vestal Virgins. Vestal Virgins actually refers to ancient Roman priestesses, but this is what it was referred to in Miner's writings. Now, the medicine men and the Vestal Virgins operate in a place that's called a latipso, Latipso. And now, because the Nasarima have such a negative view of human bodies, they also have a lot of strong normative prohibitions against nudity. And oftentimes, I mean, they even believe that, like, if a child just accidentally sees an adult naked, that evil spirits are going to enter into their heads, and again, they're going to be damaged for the rest of their life. And so nudity is very much frowned upon and is considered humiliating for the Nasarima to be nude, especially around other people and people they don't know that well. So one of the first things, if the Nasarima feel that they are ill or being inflicted by evil spirits, they'll go to the Laripso, and the first thing the medicine men have them, or the Vestal Virgins, depending on which one's working with them at the time, first thing they have them do is strip naked. So automatically degrading them, and at that point automatically engaging in sadistic behavior. Then they will oftentimes strap them down, the Nasarima, to these hard boards. They will take slivers of metal, sharp metal, and that they are believed to be magically treated, and then poke them into the skin of the Nasarima, all in the belief that this will make them better. Now, if you talk to a child among the Nasarima and you ask them what the Latipso is, they will say something like, well, that's where people go to die. And that's true. Most Nasarima do die in a Latipso. Um, that's a correct statement. However, adult Nasarima will still go to the Latipso in order to try to preserve their lives. Um, Despite the fact that most will die in a Latipso. Then also, life is traumatic, and going through life, people experience different traumas and different things that cause them troubles. And there's a whole sadistic institution that was developed that Miner refers to as the listeners. So it's not enough that you experience a trauma for the first time. But the job of the listeners is to get the members of the Latipso to relive the trauma over and over and over again, thus making sure to re-traumatize them again and again. Then we also see the belief that there's a lot of emphasis placed on teeth among the Nasarima. And it's believed that if your teeth don't look exactly like everyone else's and don't look just a certain way, that you're not going to be popular, that you'll be socially rejected, that you won't be considered attractive in terms of the values of the Nasarima. And so there's a sadistic institution referred to as the Holy Mouthmen. Now, Miner tells us this is a loose translation of what the Nasarima actually call this group, but the Holy Mouthmen do all sorts of things. Like they will end up forcing the teeth of the Nasarima to change position. They will take refined stones that with a point and drill holes into the teeth of the Nasarima and take molten metal and pour them into the holes. And also for a group that that thinks that having all your teeth is highly important socially, the Holy Mouthmen are also very commonly pull the teeth of the Nasarima out. But again, the Nasarima believe you have to go to the Holy Mouth Bin in order to keep your teeth, and so you have to undergo the pain and suffering in order to be socially accepted. Now, we also see, I've talked a little bit about the role of women among the Nasarima in terms of child rearing. And this is, as I said, a patriarchal society. And so women are particularly valued for sex appeal among the Nasarima. And the Nasarima have beauty ideals that are actually outside the realm of human possibility when it comes to women. So, for example, the Nasarima, the males of the Nasarima, value very large breasts in women. Breasts that do not occur naturally. Breasts don't typically grow to the size that the Nasarima find attractive. And so there's a whole group of medicine men women who want to try to approach this beauty ideal will go to. And what these medicine men do is they will actually cut open the breast of women and stuff them with sand and rocks and things of this sort that have been refined. It's not like they're just picking up, jagged rocks and sticking them in people's bodies. And so because it's been refined by their techniques, they argue that it's safe and it's just fine, even though it can cause death in women who get these kinds of procedures done. And it causes severe pain if it's not done well. It can cause all kinds of health issues, and even if it is done well, it can cause significant health issues. But it's still something that's considered valuable, and thus something that you see many, not all of Nazarene women, but many go and do. And then women can also earn a living by traveling from village to village and allowing, particularly the males of the Nasarima, to stare at their exposed bodies. Again, this is illustrating kind of this double standard between men and women, because remember that they view nudity as being very negative, and yet women can go from village to village, especially if they've had these procedures done on their breasts, and earn a living doing this. So, let me tell you this: minor is messing with you. The Nasarima is American spelled backwards. So, if you're wondering how to spell the Nasarima, spell American backwards. That's what it is. The Latipso is spelled like hospital backwards, except the H is left off the end. What he is doing with this is trying to illustrate the way that people who will go into a culture, and that is, say, a tribal culture, for instance. And this is particularly written towards anthropologists, but these are lessons that sociologists can learn from as well, in dealing with other cultures generally. And then if you're practicing ethnocentrism, you're again going to misunderstand the culture that you're looking at. And so you see anthropologists of 100 years ago labeling cultures as primitive, when the cultures actually had very sophisticated social structures and cultures, and complex cultures. And this notion of primitive was very much a judgment. So he was saying, look, if we were to practice, say, pretend that we're coming from a different culture and analyzing American culture, we can do this. So, what are some of the things, like the view of the body? Yeah, Americans really look down on nudity, and find, especially public nudity, to be amore, almost breaching on a taboo. By shrines, they mean bathrooms. Bathrooms are where you go to control your body, to alter your body, to make it presentable for public, so to speak. Sacred boxes, medicine cabinets, the potions and elixirs, prescriptions, training the children. He's talking about potty training. The medicine men, obviously doctors, Vestal virgins, nurses, listeners, psychiatrists and psychologists, holy mouth men, dentists, um, the women traveling from town to town, the sex industry, getting breast implants, for instance. Silicone implants, what do you think silicone is? It's refined sand. And what's sand but broken down rocks? So, this is all the things he's talking about here. So, who are the Nasarima? They are us, Americans. Now, magical thinking enters into this. To illustrate magical thinking is something that humans across the board will engage in from time to time. And it's not just humans, actually. We see that other species will also engage in magical thinking. For instance, one of the major figures in psychology of the school of thought known as behaviorism, B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner would do all kinds of experimentations on different species of animals. And he was doing this, running this series of experiments on pigeons. And so here's what he did. He set up a lever that was attached to a food dispenser. And so he taught the pigeons that if they push the lever, it releases food. And so every time they wanted food, they would go and press the lever, and the food pellet would pop out, and they would eat it. Then what he did after the pigeons had learned that pushing the lever means getting food, he then disconnected the lever from the food dispenser and set the food dispenser on to randomly release food pellets. And so it had no connection whatsoever to the lever. And pigeons were still, they were going up because, well, they had learned pressing the lever gives you food. And so they kept going up, hitting the lever, hitting the lever, hitting the lever. Once you train an animal to do something, they kind of just always do it, right? Um, unless you all work very hard to train them to stop. And that can be much more difficult than training them to do something. But there was one pigeon that B.F. Skinner wrote about in particular. It was hitting the lever, and then just by happenstance, looked over its left shoulder, hit the lever, and a pellet fell out, ate the food. Then it came back, and again hitting the lever, nothing happens. And then again, just by chance, the pigeon looked over its left shoulder, hit the lever, and that just happened to coincide with when the food was supposed to be released. So it was released and it ate the food. Well, at this point, then the pigeon thought it had found a pattern, right? And it had learned to start looking over its left shoulder. So the pigeon suddenly starts looking like it's having a seizure. It's just looking over its left shoulder and hitting the lever constantly, even though most of the time that it looked over the left shoulder and hit the lever, nothing happened. And so when we're talking about magical thinking, we're talking about false pattern recognition. You may have heard people say the saying that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results. Now, first of all, in the social sciences, we don't use the concept insanity. So that has no scientific legitimacy whatsoever. Secondly, if you want to talk about it in terms of mental illness comes in a variety of different things and has nothing to do with trying the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results. Um, However, that is a really good definition for magical thinking, trying the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results. And humans do it too. And it's not just pigeons. For instance, if you've ever been sitting at an elevator and you hit the button and the button lights up. And so, you know, the elevator will make its way down to you eventually. But say you're in a hurry and you're late for a meeting or something, and so you know that the button's hit, you know that it's lit up, but you hit it again, and you keep hitting the button, you keep hitting the button. What are you doing? Do you think the elevator is up on the top floor going, oh shit, they're in a hurry, I better get down there? No, of course not. But it makes you feel like you're doing something. It's the same kind of thing like when cities put in crosswalk buttons. Typically, those aren't connected to anything. It's to give people the sense of control over the situation, and so it gives them something to do. They keep hitting the button, and it's not connected to anything. It's not going to cause the lights to change. Think about it. If you've got a really busy pedestrian city and people keep hitting the button, then that's going to really disrupt traffic. You can't let it connect to the traffic lights. So, but the point of it is so that people don't just walk out in traffic. And we find in cities that put in those buttons on crosswalks that the instances of pedestrians being hit by cars actually decreases significantly. And it's again this feeling that you have some kind of control over your environment. One last example, and then I'll move on, and we'll get back into the Henslin chapter. Would be athletes. Now, with athletes, for instance, when I was in high school, I played football, and I knew this guy who we won a game, and then he for the next game he had forgotten to wash his jock strap, and we won a game, the second game. Well, at this point, then he thinks he's identified a pattern. It's a false pattern, but he thinks he's identified one. And he suddenly decides that his dirty jockstrap is lucky. And so he's not going to wash it because that'll wash the luck off. Even though many of us begged him to wash it because it started to just reek. It was so smelly and dirty, especially as the season wore on. And we lost games, and he still wouldn't wash it. So you'll see that a lot of times among athletes. This kind of magical thinking in terms of luck. So that's magical thinking. All right. Now let's start breaking down different aspects of culture. For the exam, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I don't want to, overload you with too much in these videos, but make sure that you know the difference between subculture, counterculture. Basically, it's just subcultures typically will operate within the broader mainstream culture, and they might have their own set of values and ways of identifying themselves differently from other subcultures. But they're not necessarily going against the mainstream culture. They're typically a part of mainstream culture. However, there is a type of subculture called counterculture that actively goes against the values, beliefs, norms of society. So, an example of a counterculture today would be like the minimalist movement. The minimalist movement is directly challenging the core cultural value in America of consumerism. Um, and so it's directly designed to be in opposition to the broader culture in the hopes ultimately of changing it. Now, we live in a pluralistic society. A pluralistic society is a society made up of many different groups, of many different subcultures, many different ways of viewing the world, many different values. And it's actually one of our strengths. Pluralistic societies don't get stuck in one way of looking at things because you have many different influences on the society. That's, for instance, you will hear people say diversity is good, but oftentimes you don't hear the explanation for why diversity is good. And here's why. Diversity is good. We've seen this in terms of small group studies as well, because you don't get stagnated in terms of a certain way of thinking. You have different ways of thinking that are brought to the table. And so it makes people more versatile as a group. You also see that people are more efficient and more effective and more creative with greater diversity. Whereas when people are all the same, practicing exactly the same culture, all the same values and everything, it leads to a kind of stagnation. Um, where whatever's happening, they're just going to try the same things over and over and over and over again. Whereas diversity ends up leading to greater innovation, um, greater adaptability to change. And so diversity is actually one of our strengths as Americans. Um, Even though some of us have started to think that it's one of our weaknesses, the research would contradict those people. It's one of our strengths. So I've discussed core values. These are the values that are central to a group around which they build a common identity. Again, core values are typically not controversial. They're typically not up for debate. It's the fish and water. It's automatically assumed. And we see in 1965, the sociologist Robin Williams, not the comedian, identified 10 core US values that you can read about in the book. I'm not going to go in and ask you in the exam to list out all 10 of them, but certainly go and read them if you haven't already. Now, these different values actually fit together in thematically. In other words, different values will share certain themes. And we call the values that share certain themes value clusters. So these are values that kind of work together and reinforce one another. The five major value clusters that have been identified in the United States and American culture is one, leisure. We highly value our leisure time. That's why you have different theme parks and water parks and party places, just and bars and all sorts of things all over the place, and all these getaways and cruises and vacation spots, and we value our leisure. Two, the notion of self fulfillment. That's actually a relatively new value cluster, because before you would sacrifice everything individually in order to better your group, to help your family, to help your society. This idea of personal self fulfillment, though, is relatively new, but has become one of the value clusters that we find in the US. The third one is physical fitness. Now, this one might seem ironic to you because, as a culture, one of the biggest threats to our health is obesity. Um, and so you say, well, how can a society whose one of the biggest health threats is obesity also have physical fitness as a value cluster? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, being obese doesn't mean you're not physically fit. Um, People can be obese for any number of reasons. There can be genetic things that are causing that. Obesity is a kind of judgment. Secondly, even if we were to be talking about people who are obese, who are unhealthy because of the obesity, and that's not everyone who would be considered medically obese, um, the appearance of taking physical fitness seriously is what the value is. And so people might go out and buy, Nike sportswear and then wear it as pajamas or loungewear around the house, or they might go out and buy a gym membership and go once or twice, and then that's it out of the year. Gyms actually plan on that. That's a big part of their income, is because if everyone who owns a membership shows up at the same time, then it's too crowded and people can't actually work out and exercise. So they expect that a good portion of the people who will sign up and pay for a year-long membership will only show up once or twice. It's a part of their business model. Number four, the fourth value cluster, youthfulness. Valuing youthfulness. This is actually one that's a little older. It's been around a little longer, where youthfulness is considered. Now, in other cultures, being older is more valued. The elders are valued for the wisdom and experience. But in our culture, we flip it around and we don't value our elders as much, but we value the youth. Part of this is connected to consumerist economics because younger people have more disposable income, less responsibilities and obligations and things of this sort. But also, our culture and cultural representations end up presenting the idea that to be attractive, to be sexually desirable, one must be youthful as well. And so older people are not seen as being as attractive. Um, Now, the fifth one is also a new one, and that is concern for the environment. And while concern for the environment, you could date back to Teddy Roosevelt and the establishment of the first state parks, concern for the environment as a global kind of issue and not just a national conservation effort is what's relatively new. And this is as more and more people come to understand that global warming is very much real and very much driven by human behavior. Now, cultures are not always consistent. Actually, cultures are rarely consistent. And we see value contradictions where to follow one value means to violate another value. And actually, in terms of trying to affect social and cultural change, pointing out value contradictions is a very valuable tool for activists trying to affect cultural change. So, for example, if you were to look at the civil rights movement of the 1960s, you would see in America the values of equality of all existed right alongside the idea of group superiority among European Americans. And so you see right there with the civil rights movement, they point out the contradiction of that. You can't believe in your particular group, however you identify it, as being superior, while at the same time saying that we're all equal. No, that's a contradiction. And so that was one of the things that the civil rights movement of the well, really the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 21st century has pointed out time and time and time and time and time again. Now, where this comes down to in terms of value contradictions, oftentimes rests between ideal culture and real culture. And whether people believe that the ideal culture is actually what's being practiced. So, ideal culture would be the ideal values and norms. It's kind of what we tell children our society is about. So, for example, we'll tell children lying is bad, but then we'll tell lies. We'll tell little white lies. We'll tell lies making excuses to get out of something we don't want to do. We'll call into work sick, even though we're not sick. And so lying is a part of society. Actually, telling people, your friends, family members, little white lies is a major example of this. For instance, if you don't want to offend somebody and they ask you, this shirt that I've already bought and wearing and I clearly like, how do you think it looks on me? And you think it looks awful. You're not going to tell the person that because that would seem rude, right? So what are you going to do to them? You're going to lie to them. You're going to say, "Oh yeah, it looks great. Looks good. Where'd you get it, man? I might go buy one." Even though no, you're never going to buy one of those. And so that would be ideal culture. right? Um, Now, real culture would be the norms and values that people actually follow. And typically, ideal culture and real culture stand in contradiction to one another. So the notion of equality is a major part of Americans' ideal culture. When it comes to real culture, our society is struck through with inequality in terms of race, ethnicity, economic class, in terms of gender, sexuality, um, uh, across the board. And so when we start looking at these things, we see that ideal culture and real culture typically stand in contradiction to one another. And that's not just an American culture. I'm just using the American culture as an example. I mean, that's the case across cultures. All cultures have ideal cultures and real cultures. Now, the values can also distort how we see the world. For example, one of the core values in America is individualism, which is a part of the value cluster self fulfillment. And individualism will often lead Americans to miss collective issues because they understand them on individualistic terms. This can even cause difficulties for those who have never experienced a collectivistic culture, never studied a collectivistic culture, in terms of understanding the lessons of sociology. Because sociology is about collective social patterns. And if you try to make everything in sociology about the individual, you're going to fundamentally misunderstand the field of sociology. And so this is an illustration of how values will set us up to see the world in one way or another, or to completely miss an aspect of how the world works. Now, sociologists and anthropologists scoured the planet over the course of the 20th century looking for cultural universals. Now, cultural universals would be a value, norm, or any cultural trait that's found in every single group across history, across geography. Now, you certainly find similarities, especially for with cultures that exist in close proximity to one another and cultures that are descended from the same root cultures. You see similarities. And all cultures have similarities. But what we end up finding out is that and the idea was this: if you could find things that were cultural universals, that were true across the board for every culture, then that would imply that there is an aspect of culture that is written into our biology, that is written into our genetics. Now, the sociologist and anthropologist of the late 19th century and across the 20th century who were looking for cultural universals couldn't find one. And I'll give you some examples. For instance, every culture has a prohibition against murder, but cultures don't define murder the same way. So for some, killing in war is murder. For others, it's not. For some, suicide is murder, and for others, it's not. For some, killing another person in self-defense is murder. For others, it's not. Just to give you an example. And so, in this sense, while you might point to, oh, well, all cultures have a prohibition against murder, isn't that a cultural universal? No, because cultures define that concept differently. The same is true for the incest taboo. I told you before that all cultures have an incest taboo, and that's true, they do. But they don't all define what incest is the same way. For instance, there are tribal cultures where they have to marry someone from another tribe, or they have to mate with someone from another tribe if they don't have a concept of marriage. Um, because even if you're not genetically related to everyone in your tribe, and there are people who have different families and different lines of genetic descent from you, because you all belong to the same tribe, you're seen as one family, and therefore mating with someone within your own tribe would be considered incest. Whereas in America, we have an incest taboo, but we define it in terms of biological relations. All right. Now, there's also, we've talked about eugenics, you've read about eugenics, and the philosophical justification behind it, known as social Darwinism. And unfortunately, you need to be on guard for ideas that were thought to be dead from the past when they come back. And one example of this would be sociobiology. Sociobiology basically argues that humans are the way that we are, that our cultures, our behaviors, the way we understand and interact and live in the world are all results of genetics. And that's the fundamental cause of all human behavior. So this is the idea of genetic determinism. Here's the problem with genetic determinism. That's also what the eugenicists thought. And so it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to say that genetics cause all human behavior, well, regardless, to saying, well, now we can find the criminal gene and lock everybody up before they even commit a crime. Um, or sterilize them so that they can't reproduce and pass on their genetic traits. And so, while sociobiology, to my knowledge, has not gone that far, um, that would be a logical extension of their basic premise. And so, I would recommend strongly that when you start hearing these kinds of arguments in terms of sociobiology, that you listen to them with a critical ear and keep in mind the history of eugenics and keep in mind that led to Nazism and the Holocaust. Because as George Santayana, the philosopher, put it, uh, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So, one example of an early sociobiologist would be Edward Wilson, who in 1975 argued that all human behavior could be explained through genetics. Geneticists even have understood with the completion of the Human Genome Project, finally in 2003, that genes influence us, certainly, but they don't define us. They have an influence, no doubt. But social conditions can also override those influences. So to give you an example, genes are about potential. They're not about guarantees. So say that you have a particular gene cluster that makes you more susceptible to developing cancer. Does that mean you're going to develop cancer? No. Say that somebody else does not have that gene cluster and both of you go and live under high power electrical lines. Well, then, speaking in terms of probability, if you have the gene cluster that makes you more susceptible for developing cancer, then you're going to be much more likely to develop cancer than the person who doesn't have it or has a different set of gene clusters. Um, and so, in that sense, that's an illustration. Genes are about potential, they're about possibilities, but they are not guarantees. And even if you do have the gene cluster for that makes you more susceptible to cancer, moving into an area that has a lot of carcinogens or that has high rates of cancer is still not a guarantee that you're going to develop cancer. It just means you're at a much higher probability of developing it. And that's just in terms of biological things like a medical condition. When you're talking about something like complex human behaviors and interactions, to say that genetics end up determining them and guaranteeing them, well, there's simply no scientific basis to make that argument for genetic determinism. So, genes can and are overridden by social conditions. So let's turn to technology. Now, generally speaking, when someone's talking about technology, they think about a computer. They think about communications technologies in America. They think about their smartphones or tablets, what have you. And those are certainly examples of technology, but they are just examples of a particular type of technology. Anything that humans create is technology. Tools, any kind of tool, the clothing that you wear, buildings even are technology, roads are technology. Um, Anything that is built by humans is a form of technology. um, and learning the skills and procedures that necessary to use the technology as the culture that created it deems it should be used is also a part of adopting a particular technology within a given society. Now, all societies end up developing new technologies. New technologies, though, are defined not in terms of the existence of the new technologies, but their broader social acceptance. And so if somebody is tinkering in their garage somewhere and they create some form of new technology, but then they don't tell anyone about it, it's not really a new technology in a sociological sense because it's not going to have any social impact. No one knows about it. So technology ends up setting a very material kind of framework or an organization for a society's non-material culture. It's oftentimes how ideas, ideologies, worldviews are either communicated or bolstered and supported. Now, we also see William Ogburn. William Ogburn is a major figure in terms of this one concept. This is one of his biggest contributions to sociology, is his research into cultural lag. Now, cultural lag is Ogburn's concept that human behavior lags behind technological innovations. So, in other words, we're really quick to accept new technologies, but new technologies require also social and cultural changes, and we're very slow to make those kinds of changes. So I'll give you an example. Texting ends up becoming generally available and popular in the late 90s. And there, at this point in time, there's no rules governing texting and driving. And as accidents, thanks to the new technology that was introduced, start rising because people are taking their eyes off the road and texting while driving, and then boom, hitting things because they're not looking at the road and they're flying down the road at 65 miles an hour. State after state started realizing that they needed to pass laws making it illegal to be on your phone or be texting while driving. And at this point in the time, it's illegal to text and drive in all 50 states of the United States. And so that illustrates, but that took decades for that to occur for all 50 states to pass those laws, and a lot of them occurred one state at a time. And that's exactly what Ogburn is talking about in terms of cultural lag. Then we have two related concepts, cultural diffusion and cultural leveling. These are the last two concepts for this chapter. Cultural diffusion occurs all the time. It is where a culture ends up adopting traits that they learn from another culture. They might adopt tools, they might adopt ideas, philosophies, what have you. But cultures diffuse, and people borrow from one another's cultures all the time. We can trace this back in terms of anthropology, thousands of years back. Um, Cultural leveling, however, is about power. It's where a culture can force another culture to accept their cultural products, ideas, perspectives. It refers especially to the process by which Western culture is being exported through globalization around the world, and the rest of the world is becoming progressively more westernized. And so this is not just cultural diffusion where people think, oh, well, I like this. Let me try this. Now, this is much more a question of power and whether or not your culture has the power to force that on other people. Another example of culture and power would be cultural appropriation, where people will steal from other cultures, but then reject as inferior the people who created the culture. And so that's cultural appropriation, which is again, that's not the same thing as cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion occurs in terms of swapping, sharing back and forth, whereas cultural leveling and cultural appropriation is about power, who has it and who doesn't. All right. So that's all the material for exam one. If anyone has any questions for me, feel free to shoot me an email. Again, I love talking about the stuff. So if you have any questions or just want to talk about the material, don't hesitate to contact me. Good luck on exam one, and I will see you in the next video.